Okay, thank you so much for actually having me in this distinguished conference. As you see that the title of my article is Does God Experience Pleasure in Perceiving His Beauty? And I'm going to explore it through philosophical and theological exploration. All right, so this paper aims to explore the divergent perspective of Muslim philosophers and theologians regarding the relationship between God's elicitation of pleasure and the perception of his beauty, with a particular focus on the argument presented by Avicenna. The structure of the article is organized into three main sections. The first examines divine beauty from both philosophical and theological viewpoints, actually in brief because time is too short. The second investigates how pleasure arises from the perception of beauty. And third, reconstruct an argument concerning the interplay between perceiving beauty and the elicitation of pleasure in God. All right, both philosophers and theologians affirm the beauty of God, articulating their views through various frameworks. Philosophers such as Al-Farabi describe divine beauty in their works. He asserts that beauty, splendor, and adornment in each existence are for its existence to be most excellent and to reach its final perfection. Since the most excellent existence is that of the first, its beauty thus surpasses the beauty of every beautiful thing. In Kitab al-Shifa, Avicenna described four criteria that constitute intellectual being, subsequently proving God's beauty. This argument is summarized in Al-Najat and Mabda wal-Ma'ad. His logical articulation posits that the necessary being is exclusive intellectual, purely good, free from any defect, and singular in every respect. There can be no greater beauty or splendor than an essence that embodies these qualities. Consequently, Avicenna concludes that the necessary being possesses superior beauty and splendor. Sohrawardi further enhances this discourse by metaphorically depicting God's beauty in his treatise, The Birds. If you can imagine a beauty that can never be touched by ugliness and a perfection that can never be approached by imperfection, you will find it there. He's sometimes the beauty of every face, sometimes the generosity of every hand. On the other hand, theologians emphasize divine attributes. Okay, I hope you see my slides. Categorizing them into two primary types, negative attributes and affirmative attributes, further divided into Jalali and Jamali attributes. The Jamali attributes represent qualities fitting for God to possess, attributes that constitute his beauty. This includes life, knowledge, power, will, hearing, sight, and speech, often referred to as the most beautiful name, Asma'ul Husna. Conversely, Jalali attributes do not directly describe God, but highlights his transcendence from imperfection. Philosophers and many theologians derive various attributes of God's perfection from his status as the necessity being, wujube wujud. They argue that the existence of necessary being is simple and devoid of parts, both in reality and thought, since a composite being relies on its part for existence. The necessary being embodies supreme perfection and absolute goodness. Thus, any form of non-existence is considered evil. Consequently, an existence free from non-existence must be regarded as pure goodness and perfection. Up to this point in our discussion, both the theologian and philosophers agree on the beauty of God. However, a point of contention arises regarding the assertion that God enjoys the perception of his own beauty, a claim that theologians criticize. Okay, this is the slide. Okay. Avicenna articulates this perspective in this way. The necessity being or necessary being who is in the utmost state of beauty, perfection, and splendor is the greatest lover and beloved for his own sake, and the greatest one who experiences pleasure and the greatest object of enjoyment. Philosophers categorically reject any notion of pain or pleasure as applicable to God. In his work, Tajrid al-I'tiqad, Ibn Sina addresses this issue under the 18th question, asserting that pain is impossible for God and denying corporeal pleasure in relation to him. To understand this distinction, it is crucial to recognize that pleasure and pain are typically derived from bodily condition. Pleasure arises from a balanced state, while pain results from imbalance. Since God's existence is necessary and non-corporeal, both pleasure and pain are negated in his case. Pain can be conceptualized as the perception of what is contrary, whereas pleasure pertains to the perception of what is mula'im or compatible. Given that there is nothing contrary to God, pain is inherently absent from his experience, while experiencing joy in this self-reflection is possible. In contrast, many prominent theologians reject the notion that God experienced pleasure. Fazal al-Miqdad argues for caution in using the term pleasure in reference to God, suggesting that affirming concepts not explicitly mentioned in the Quran and Hadith is inappropriate. Muhammad Bahrani simply contends that even intellectual pleasure cannot be attributed to God due to the absence of legal basis for such claims. He emphasized that God's names are definitive. However, Al-Mahili seeks a stronger argument from Ibn Sina through induction. In his book, Secrets of Hidden in Rational Sciences, he mentions that we challenge them, i.e., philosophers, to provide proof that perceiving perfection necessarily leads to pleasure. If they rely on induction for this claim, we would argue that it does not yield certainty. Thus, I will continue my exploring whether there is a necessary connection between perceiving a perfect being and experiencing pleasure. To adequately address Al-Mahili's critique, it is essential to conduct a comprehensive examination of the concept of pleasure, particularly as articulated by Avicenna, which he adopts a multifaceted, let's say, approach to pleasure, discussing it in relation to various philosophical topics. In his writings, Ibn Sina defines pleasure as the perception and attainment of that which is perfect and good. He elaborates on the conditions necessary for the realization of pleasure, identifying two key factors. First, the object or entity being perceived must possess perfection and goodness. Second, the perceiver must recognize and comprehend that perfection and goodness. If we interpret perfection and goodness in this context as those qualities that are perceived, then Al-Mahili's objection remains unsolved. This concern echoes a point raised by Fakhruddin Razi, who argues that understanding a perfect thing does not necessarily lead to the experience of pleasure. There is no inherent necessity between perception and pleasure. For example, a sick person may perceive a perfect meal, but still derive no enjoyment for it.
Maryam, you have 10 minutes, yeah?
Okay, it's fine. Thus, according to Fakhruddin Razi, analysis, while the perception of a tangible object characterized by a perfection and goodness may facilitate an understanding of pleasure. It does not guarantee that pleasure will be experienced. This examination highlights the complexity of relationship between perception and pleasure, suggesting that further exploration is needed to clarify whether a necessary connection exists between perceiving perfection and experiencing pleasure. In his writing, Ibn Sina offers a second definition of pleasure. It is the perception of what is mula'im or compatible. This concept has also been referred by theologians, including Al-Mehelli. But what does mula'im signify? Ibn Sina defines mula'im as that which contributes to the perfection of an essence or completes a specific action associated with that essence. In essence, every being has a particular mula'im relative to itself, which leads to its perfection or the fulfillment of its specific purpose. For example, each cognitive faculty, such as anger, desire, imagination, and intellect, has its own unique compatibility. To clarify, each cognitive faculty is designed for a specific purpose. Therefore, anything that aligns with that faculty and directs it toward its intended goal is considered compatible and pleasurable. For instance, a sweet taste is pleasurable because it provides nourishment more effectively than other flavors. This can be structured as follows. The first premise, the purpose of taste is nourishment. The second, the sweet taste provides nourishment more effectively than any other flavor and fulfillment the concept of nourishment. Therefore, the sweet taste is pleasurable. Similarly, pleasant and moderate sounds are enjoyable for their compatibility with auditory faculties. Ibn Sina posits that the perception of pleasure arises when the specific action of cognitive faculties align with the goals and purposes of their respective essence. The actions of these faculties are realized only in relation to external objects. They achieve their specific actions only upon reaching their particular perfection. When this occurs without any adverse effects, appropriate pleasure results. Beyond sensory faculty, Ibn Sina also addresses pleasure derived from intrinsic faculties. For instance, he argued that the pleasure associated with anger stems from the sense of dominance it evokes, and instinctively response deeply rooted in animals that leads to feeling of power and control. Ibn Sina further explores intellectual mula'ams or compatibilities with the rational faculty. Objects perceived by this faculty possess characteristics such as necessity, universality, and eternity, while sensory pleasures are often shallow and temporary. This distinction underscores that intellectual mula'im share similar attributes. He contends that the rational soul is simple and cannot be composite, thus it holds superiority over other faculties. Consequently, the pleasure attained by human beings, or the rational soul, or even the intellectual entities in the afterlife cannot be compared to those experienced in this world. It is entirely abstract and possesses greater intensity and quality than material pleasure. All right. Ibn Sina asserts a fundamental connection between pleasure and goodness. In his works, he states that every soul's faculty has its own pleasure and goodness. In this statement, he associates goodness with pleasure, presenting it as an intrinsic characteristic of each faculty. He posits that the pleasure of the appetite faculty arises when it attains its specific compatible quality from among 5 essential qualities. According to Ibn Sina, the actual perfection of each faculty constitutes the goodness that is specific to that faculty. something inherently compatible that ultimately leads to the realization of pleasure. From his perspective, this relationship forms a foundational principle of pleasure. When we ally this principle with Ibn Sina's earlier assertions, it becomes evident that mula'am refers to the specific action of the essence within each cognitive faculty. Furthermore, both mula'am and a specific action represent the perfection and goodness of the cognitive faculty. This understanding cannot be equated with merely perceiving the perception, the perfection, and goodness of external objects. Rather, it arises from within the human soul or cognitive faculty following such perception. Based on these two definitions, we can derive two principles for eliciting pleasure, perfection and mula'am. These principles can also be applied to God's elicitation of pleasure through the perception of his beauty. The logical structure of this argument is as follows, as you can see in my slide. First premise, the essence of rational pleasure or intellectual pleasure is derived from the perception of perfection and harmony. Second premise, God exists in the utmost beauty, splendor, and perfection. Third, God perceives his essence characterized by utmost beauty, splendor, and perfection. Fourth, this perception occurs without any hindrance or harm to the perceiver. Fifth, which is the most important one, the perception of a complete existence or perfect essence, which embodies ultimate beauty and splendor, actualizes the potential for understanding within the divine intellect compared to every other attributes. Therefore, we conclude that perception of divine beauty and splendor is pleasurable for the necessary being. All right. In conclusion, this presentation has explored the intricate relationship between pleasure, goodness, and perception of divine beauty, as articulated by philosophers, specifically Ibn Sina, by examining his definition of pleasure and principles of and the principles such as mula'am, we have established a framework for understanding how these concepts interact with the context of God's nature. The argument presented demonstrates that the perception of divine beauty and perfection is not only inherent to God's essence, but also elicites pleasure for the necessary being. This exploration highlights the philosophical depth of philosophers' thoughts and actually their implications for our understanding of divine, ultimately affirming the significance of pleasure as a fundamental aspect of for both human cognition and divine experience. Thank you so much for your attention.